And we have come finally to the last of our videos on Euripides' plays. Welcome back. And I hope that you really found this play, Bacchae, absolutely stunning. There are a few images of a god which are more frightening, more consternating than that image of Dionysus there in the prologue, storming on stage and proclaiming in his terrific anger his plans to unseat his cousin Pentheus and overtake the city of Thebes to punishment for its hubristic refusal to worship him. Now, Dionysus, of course, was a rather questionable god in the Greek pantheon. He, of course, had quite a violent birth, being torn apart a couple of different times. On one occasion, we have Dionysus as the embryo inside his mother Semele. Semele had a group of sisters who were jealous of her and convinced her that she was married to some monster. This was when Semele was, of course, tied in with Zeus, and insisted that Semele have Zeus reveal himself to her in his true form. So as a result, Semele had Zeus swear on the river Styx, and then made that request. And Zeus could not convince Semele to select a different request, and so therefore Zeus showed himself as a fireball or a lightning bolt, depending on the version, and caused the death of Semele, of course. Now we have baby Dionysus there in Semele's womb, and so Dionysus gets rescued out of the body by Father Zeus, who then gets Dionysus sewn into his thigh and gives birth. Although, as you notice, Euripides has a little bit of byplay with that story by suggesting that possibly Dionysus was actually a slave, homoros, which was true, that Dionysus had in fact served as a slave for the Amazonian queen Hippolyte, and as part of the madness that he ended up being beset with from his mother Hera. It's conceivable, therefore, that homoros, meaning slave, is what really happened to Dionysus, as opposed to meros, M-E-R-O-S, the word for limb, which is what is supposed to suggest that Dionysus actually was stitched into Zeus's limb. In any event, Dionysus ends up being born, but then gets torn up all over again by Titans, with whom Hera conspired. So he's tied up all over again and has to be reborn again when his heart is saved. In some versions, it's actually his heart that gets implanted into Zeus's thigh in order to be born. So the story is rather tangled as to what exactly goes on with Dionysus. Now, the story about being torn up in shreds, as you also saw played out quite vividly in this play, is the concept sparagmos, which is the Greek word for scattering or sowing, like sowing seed, but also in this case refers to being torn asunder, as in fact happens with Dionysus himself, and will also happen to his cousin Pentheus. So we have here a family feud going on, because Semele, both during life and after life, was slandered by her sisters for having been married to a basically prostitute man instead of Zeus, or that she was a prostitute herself. So that's one reason why Dionysus is furiously angry at the city of Thebes. And then Dionysus, as we said, was kind of a strange fellow himself, because he wandered around as a madman. He ended up going off to the east, where he had a habit of riding on the backs of panthers. So he's often depicted in art with wild cats. Of course, there's the thyrsus, which is sort of your huge dildo type of thing. You have the maenads, the maniac women who run around carrying that object, in order to worship him. There's a whole notion of ecstasy, which is basically madness. Literally in Greek, it means standing out of yourself. That, of course, has a very unsettling effect on on perfectly normal civilized people. So that's something the Greeks also may not have particularly liked. So for all these reasons, the Greeks tried to marginalize Dionysus, essentially treating him as a Greek god who's not really Greek. Who is Greek, he has to be accepted in the Greek pantheon, but his origins really reflect a sense of non-Greekness, something from the East that comes in. Dionysus, of course, is credited with the invention of wine, and that, of course, was vital for Greek meals, but also for Greek trade, and, of course, other parts of Greek culture, too. So that's such an important invention and an attribution that Dionysus has to be accepted in the Greek pantheon, despite his rather manic, crazy traits. Definitely a lot of irrationality. So Dionysus looks like the total picture of irrationality when he comes on stage in Bacchae to carry out his murderous mission against his cousin. So what has happened? Cousin Pentheus has decided that the worship of Bacchus is to be completely forbidden anywhere in the city of Thebes. So when Dionysus and his Bacchants show up, the first thing they do is to drive the women mad, to run around in the wilderness, and thereupon basically bring down Theban society, because, of course, the women underpinned a lot of society with all of their domestic tasks like weaving and child care and taking care of the fields and such. All of that falls apart as soon as the women abandon all of their posts, as it were, in service of Dionysus. So there's a stranger who is there to announce what's going on, and the stranger is taken prisoner and held inside the palace. Pentheus gets him. Pentheus is given warnings by Tiresias and Cadmus, the founder of Thebes, that he should not act this way, that he should actually cooperate with the worship of Dionysus. But of course, in typical hubristic fashion, he refuses, and he makes the unwise decision to imprison this stranger. Well, the stranger, of course, cannot be imprisoned. He actually wears shackles in a fake way to make it look like he's been taken prisoner, when in fact he hasn't been. And he ends up throwing them off and destroying his prison in a really dramatic central scene. So when Pentheus and the stranger confront each other again, the stranger starts playing on Pentheus' real desire to find out exactly what's going on with these women. It's obvious that Pentheus has some kind of an Apollo-Dionysus problem here, about wanting to really know what's going on with the women while claiming that he wants to reject this worship altogether. So the stranger finally convinces Pentheus to dress up as a woman. There are a few things more humiliating to do to a man than this. So Pentheus agrees, dresses up as a woman, and then goes out in the wilderness to watch the women in their festive celebration. And in the middle of that, when he climbs up on a tree and is now vulnerable, the stranger suddenly disappears, shows up as a column of light, and proclaims in this loud, thunderous voice to the women that they have been spied upon, and that the spy is right there within their grasp at the top of the tree. The women go and surround the tree, and with some effort are able finally, with their superhuman strength, to bring down the tree. And Pentheus' mother, Agave, A-G-A-V-E, ends up tearing him limb from limb. And so the same thing that happened to Dionysus, the same kind of thing that is featured in tragedy as what happens to one's soul when one undergoes the process of tragedy, all of that is now visited on the person of Pentheus. Agave has to go through an anagnorisis now of exactly what happened in her state of madness. So her father Cadmus is there to help her through the stage. She thinks that she's killed a lion. She takes home the head of Pentheus, the decapitated remains of him, and she parades it everywhere saying, "Look, I killed a lion." Of course, Dionysus himself is associated with a lion, so therefore the connection is not entirely arbitrary. Her father is horrified at this and gradually is able to bring her back to her senses, and then she realizes tragically that she's actually killed her son. This is really terrifying stuff, and the Thebans really suffer one of the worst forms of punishment that we see in any Greek tragedy, in fact. The fact that the one who is hubristic this time finally does suffer a proper punishment. And also, of course, that wonderful portrayal of the god at the beginning is probably what allowed this play finally, after Euripides' death, by the way, to earn a victory. Dionysus appears at the end of the play in order to mete out the appropriate punishments. And unlike the fairly mellow Dioscuri, this guy is absolutely out for punishment in every form he can come up with. So what do we have? Of course, Pentheus suffered his proper death. He got nicely torn up in pieces, just the way he should be, because of the way that he rejected Dionysus' worship. That's the way it should be. Good. Then we have, of course, all of the Thebans who have to build an appropriate shrine for Dionysus to worship him correctly this time. And we have, of course, King Cadmus, the one who originally killed a snake in order to found the city. Turns out that Cadmus said to Pentheus, you and I obviously both know that Dionysus isn't really a god, but we have to pretend for appearance's sake. So let's just go through the process, and we'll just keep on knowing that Dionysus isn't a real god, but it's okay. We can still worship him. Dionysus is not happy about that. And so Cadmus is going to be turned into a snake, as is his wife Harmonia. And Agave, of course, is going to have to be exiled for her role in murdering her son. So it's pretty damning stuff that is visited upon the city of Thebes. This probably is one of the best depictions of the way the tragic art works with mythology, as we've been seeing through the course as you've been reading these tragedies. What you really get here is the true punishment of hubris, carried out by a god who in this particular case happens to be the direct victim of the hubris. There are other plays of Euripides where we see this, such as Hippolytus, in which we see that Hippolytus' decision to refuse to worship Aphrodite will have dire results, because Aphrodite will set Hippolytus' stepmother Phaedra against him, and Phaedra will ultimately bring around the destruction of Hippolytus and the great regret of her husband Theseus, who, believing the letter that Phaedra wrote before she committed suicide, ended up bringing the curse down upon Hippolytus that in fact was undeserved. So you have Hippolytus who, through his decision to refuse to worship a god, ends up being appropriately punished for that. And in like manner, here we have Pentheus, who also will be punished because he too, in this case, commands his entire city to entirely reject the worship of Dionysus. So the whole idea of sparagmos is that the experience of watching tragedy is that one goes through essentially a spiritual ripping apart. One's preconceptions of the way the world are supposed to work are called into question as humans who end up committing rash acts, sometimes with moral blindness, end up running up against divine will, as in fact their acts receive punishment. In some cases, the humans can't do anything about the tragedy that's to be carried out, as we see with Aeschylus's plays. In some cases, the humans are able to respond as best they can, and still are unable to really remedy their problem, and that's what we see in Sophocles' plays. Now with Euripides' plays, what we've seen is what happens with human nature at its absolute worst. Human nature is simply bound to be fallible, destructive, hubristic, arrogant, and in many ways completely irremediable. And so Pentheus certainly comes off as a character who deserves his punishment, but Dionysus in his own way is just as bad, because as the Thebans tried to plead with him, in fact, the decision not to worship him could have been remedied in much gentler ways than in fact occurred, but as we well know, Dionysus is not a gentle god. It was within his power to carry out this punishment, and he did it with all vivid colors. So I appreciate the journey that you've taken through this course, through our tragic plays. We still need to wrap up Athenian history, and then we'll have some final comments on tragedy in our final lecture video of this course. And we'll see you then.